It's nice to see you all. So we've got 2 more weeks is my plan. This week is Paul, and next week I'll have 1 hour before a session meeting, and it will be on the Johannine corpus. We've done some of that already with the Gospel of John, so the focus will be more on the revelation of John. And by the way, there is only one revelation of John. It's never revelations. Okay, even Newsweek got that wrong. Drove me crazy. It's not revelations. I used to say I had 2 goals in my first congregation. I wanted everybody to know what the exile was, and I wanted everybody to know there was only one revelation of John. So, all right. So the Apostle Paul. It's interesting. I am very grateful for the fact that that our religion, Christianity, is based on Jesus and not on the Apostle Paul. Because the Apostle Paul had, who I think was brilliant, he was also seemed to be a troubled man. And maybe I'm just projecting. I see him as a lot like me. So, an interesting thing happened to him. He was a passionate theologian, meaning he'd really he dove in to the theological structure of what Judaism needed to be. And it was Pharisaic in its focus. Now, what that means, the Pharisees are known for being focused on keeping the law. Why keep the law? Well, because that's how one lives out the covenant with God who loves us. I mean, at its best, that makes all the sense in the world. You want to follow the law because God's law is there so that we will know how to live in harmony and peace with the people around us. I mean, so, the Gospels do a pretty good job of making fun of it, but I think when they do, they miss, we can miss the point. I don't think they do, but we can miss the point that the law was important. We talked when we talked about Exodus, I'm going to talk about it again this Sunday, that law came to the people of Israel in the story of the Exodus after they were saved from bondage, right? And the reason it was given to them was so that this enslaved people who'd been ordered around for centuries would be able to form a society that would operate connected to God's purpose. And that's what the law is for. And so the Pharisees were very attached to the idea that we had to follow the law. Why? Well, the Roman Empire had taken over Israel, and the Pharisees felt like if we lived more faithfully up to the law, then God would move to have Israel be the nation that ruled the world, not Rome. So we understand why that was the case, and Paul was a very passionate theologian, wanting to wanted to use it. He used political power with it. He was looking to change society with it. I mean, what does that sound like? Do we have anybody in the world like that now? It really does feel like, well, evangelical Christians would be one that are very tied to a kind of theological interpretation of what's happening and want political power. The same would be true of on the left of liberation theologians in South America. Right? We had something interesting happen in Marin some time ago. The Marin Organizing Committee, MOC. Have you ever heard of the organizing committees out there? Yeah, Gary has. All right. So this is where the the political tradition that Obama grew up in Chicago, right? And there's a way to organize people to have political power, right? And they try and get the liberal churches involved. And in Marin, that's what they did. They tried to get the liberal churches involved. And it always gave me pause. It's not that I disagreed with the goals often. I mean, they were interested in helping the homeless. They wanted the government to do a better job on that. But the methods were, to me, abusive in power. They weren't relational. They, at some level, they were looking to project power because they knew the right thing to do, rather than to enter into relationship and work out the right thing to do. And maybe that's a particular bias of mine, but I think Christianity, the message of Christianity, as does Paul, is about power. And Jesus's power is built on the movement of God that moves from death to new life. So it's not coercive power. By its very nature, it's not. And so, I don't want to push it too far because, well, I'll say this in a moment, but that is the difference that Jesus was trying to bring across. That the power that we're talking about, that Jesus was tapping into, that Paul understood, was the power of change, the power, I will call it evolution, where God moves from death to new life, and rather than working coercively. That's the insight that Jesus brought, and it's the insight that Paul picked up on pretty quickly. You always say that leads you directly to a doctrinaire pacifist stance, right? And so I've always sort of wrestled with that. Anybody hear of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Bonhoeffer is a very well-known theologian. He was murdered in a concentration camp towards the end of the Second World War. He was there because he was part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. His part in the plot, he happened to be from a military family, and that's how he got involved. And his part in the plot was to talk to Allied leaders to try and make some communication as things were unfolding, and the plot was uncovered. And Bonhoeffer was put in a concentration camp, and he wrote a book called Ethics at that moment. And here's the thing: he believed that God's power is not coercive. He believed what I just said, that it wasn't coercive, that it's a power that is willing to let death come so that new life can evolve. He was a doctrinaire pacifist, so he had to write a book to explain why he was part of a plot to murder Hitler. Didn't make any sense, So his way of wrestling with it was to say, well, it is wrong. It was absolutely wrong to try and murder Hitler. On the other hand, sometimes you have to listen to God's voice and do the wrong thing. Right? That was where his answer came out. Right? But there's this wrestling in the scriptures, particularly in the Christian scriptures, about the nature of power and how it plays out. Jesus went to the cross rather than to foment a political rebellion. That seems pretty clear historically, even within these, sort of opaque texts, meaning they're opaque to the history. Yeah, Jack?
How do you merge this belief in with the scripture that says God perfects his power in weakness?
Well, that's exactly how I would do it. It's the weakness of allowing the next thing to happen. God's weakness is that he doesn't project coercive power. God's power is seen in how things unfold from there. I think that's exactly what that means. But we're not living in a perfect world, and so we wrestle with these things. I mean, at some level, I wish I could be a doctrinaire pacifist. It makes sense. But then you meet moral issues that demand something else of you. And I think that's something that our faith has to wrestle with. Because at root, we're dealing with a God who allows death to come on a cross and then seeks new life and resurrection. That's the foundation of the faith. And so how do you then work with that? The Apostle Paul tries in Romans, suggests that, well, there is a place for the coercive power of the state. We need to be subject to the state for the proper ordering of government and so on and so forth. But Paul was this passionate theologian, and he was dealing with the law. Somebody saying something?
No.
Okay. He was dealing with the law, and he was trying to move Israel to a place where its faithfulness to God would allow God to move forward. And lo and behold, he had a revelatory experience. Okay. Now we have the Acts of the Apostles that talk about it. You know, he's on a horse, he's on a road to Damascus, boom, you know, light comes, whatever all else. The interesting thing about Acts is that it was written decades after Paul was dead. And there's some question to how historical it is. With Paul, we are fortunate to have firsthand information about what happened to him. So let me just read to you how he describes it in Galatians. For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it, and I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my own people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I may preach him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with flesh and blood. He had some sort of revelatory experience. He doesn't describe a horse or a light, okay? But something happened. And as a result of that, he says, I didn't go up to Jerusalem to the apostles who were before me, but instead I went away to Arabia. And again, I then returned to Damascus. I told you I project a little bit onto Paul. I get it. I was a pastor for 6.5, 7 years at my first church. And I was a pretty conservative theological thinker when I was in seminary and in that first call. But also during that first call, my first wife was dying the whole time. You know, Deb and I were married for 9.5 years, and Deb was sick for 9.5 years. And at the end, when she died, I arrived at a conclusion, right? Either the God I'd been talking about, this conservative God, either that God didn't exist, or that God hated me. Okay? One of the two things seemed true to me at that moment, right? And since it didn't make any sense to me that God was a hateful God, and I hadn't been preaching that, right? All right? I had to come to terms with why these things were happening. What was the nature of God and the nature of God's power and how it unfolds? What does God allow to have happen? So on and so forth. It was so dramatic that I spent a year at Princeton Seminary arguing, fighting, wrestling, trying to figure it all out until I really completely remade my theological thinking. All right? So I came out at the end of the year not thinking about God, in the ways that I had thought about God. And I think this is what happened to Paul. He was this theologian thinking things through. He had an extraordinary revelatory experience. He goes away to Arabia and rethinks and tries to make sense of what he believed given his experience of the risen Lord, is the way he describes it. And in that transformation, he becomes an extraordinary leader of the Christian religion. Right? Jesus didn't start a religion. Paul did. That's what it comes down to. Jesus was trying to teach the Jews. Jesus was trying to interpret the law through the principles of love. Jesus was trying to see God's work as a work of grace that was unfolding in the world. Right? But he wasn't starting a religion. He would have been appalled, just appalled to find out that he'd started a new religion. Paul, on the other hand, he would be disappointed that he started another religion, but his thinking moved this little sect of the way, right, into a context where it needed to split from the mothership. Right? I happen to find that a tragedy, but it is what he did. Right? And the reason was that there were two fundamental issues that Paul had to deal with. Right? And the first was the question that came up was, do you have to be a Jew first in order to be a Christian? In order to receive the salvation, in order to be caught up in the kingdom of heaven that Jesus had been promoting, did you have to become a Jew? And Paul insisted not. It was an issue that split that community wide open. Right? And you can get a sense of that in Galatians. I'll read you just a little bit. Paul's talking about some people that came down to the Galatian church and suggested that you needed to become a Jew first. Now, the way that works out is circumcision, right? That's symbolic for becoming a Jew first, right? Filling the law. But he says, look, I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting him who called you to the grace of Jesus Christ and turning to a different gospel. Not that there could be another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and who want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so we say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to that which you received, let him be accursed. Paul was not a light guy, okay? You know people in the church who are like this. They insist they're right and everybody else is wrong. I mean, it splits things wide open, right? And that's exactly what Paul did. There was anger and rancor and division in this group, and it was Paul's rather clear understanding of the gospel that drove that division. And what's fascinating to me is the basis of that division is that there should be no division. You know, he was all about unity. No, you don't have to be a Jew first to receive the grace of God. Everyone can receive the grace of God. Right? It's all about, Jesus is inclusionary, not exclusionary. Right? There's no male and female. There's no Jew nor Greek. You know, I mean, he was all about saying there are no divisions. Everybody is one in Christ. Right? So the first thing is no separation, no duality, nothing outside versus inside. And that's because of the second thing that he concludes. He doesn't focus on Jesus of Nazareth. You know, he hardly quotes Jesus at all. You have to go a long way to find anything in the Pauline letters that are quotes anything like turning up in the four Gospels. You can tell that it might be in the same social stream, but he's really not. No, for him, Christ, who was expressed in Jesus of Nazareth, had a much more cosmic feel. Right? I mean, think about what we've been going through in the letter of Paul to the Romans in chapter 6. He talks about there being a first Adam and a second Adam. Right? The first Adam, we are attached to because we are fallen. And the second Adam, well, that's Christ. We become attached to that, and something new happens. That's more than Jesus of Nazareth. That's a cosmic switch for Paul. He's looking to attach human life to a much different thing that is beyond an individual that wanders around in Palestine. All right. So those are the two things, and then I'll open this up to questions because I'm not sure I've been clear. But the two things that are central to Paul's thought. All right. One is there's no separation. No Jew, no Greek, no male, no female. Those aren't the identities that keep us apart or together, because connection to Christ is what draws all things together in perfect harmony. So let me stop there for a moment. Do you have questions or responses to that? Chat.
The first of the two Galatians you described his experience. I've always interpreted that as Jesus appeared to him and said, Paul, I've decided you're going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. You're going to be the fulfillment of what we've been talking about for 1,000 years or so. Go out there and tell them about my teachings, which were kind of Jewish, except that if you take a look at the law, the Ten Commandments are more behavioral. Jesus raised it another level to the thought before the behavior. The thought before the behavior. Don't be angry because it leads to murder, and murder is not allowed. Don't commit adultery in your mind before you commit it. So he raises it to a higher level, but that's kind of another question. React to my idea that basically Christians should be pretty much acting like Jews, except that we can have a lobster sandwich.
Well, I mean, we come up with traditional laws as a way to show our faithfulness. I have good friends who keep the Sabbath. I think I've mentioned it. Sometimes I think it's absurd. I go over on the Sabbath and they say, "Oh, Gentile alert, would you turn on the light for us?" It seems sort of absurd at some level. At another level, it's respectful of the divine. The law is there, and it's there to provide a kind of spiritual practice that connects us. For instance, saying grace. I don't know. Fewer and fewer Christian families say grace at dinner every night, right? And that's okay. I mean, I'm not being judgmental about anything like that, but it is a kind of spiritual discipline that forms the mind to be thankful for what we receive. It's not something we do to please God exactly, or to keep God off our backs. It's something we do to be formed, right? But and so I understand Paul's interest in the law, but what he didn't want to do is have it be so exclusive that it ignored the fact that it was reflective of this creative power of Christ. He was very Christocentric, not very Jesus-centric, which is why at some level, I think he's a theologian for today, even though the liberal church has tossed him out. all because of that women stuff. We, and that's stuff that has to be interpreted. You know, it's anachronistic. I get that. But nevertheless, it misses the real point of Paul, and that is that we can't see ourselves as separate from one another, act separate from one another. That's why if Paul were here, he would say if there's a homeless person on the street, that means the society has failed. That's what it means. Right? That's why we care for the poor, because that's how you make everything whole. Right? He's connected to this, to the Christ, which is from his point of view, a cosmic, creative power that is unfolding. We die with him in a death like his. We're risen with him in a resurrection like his when we place our faith and faithfulness in the Christ. Right? But Paul is a setup, when you look at it 2,000 years later, to understand that it's not different. Yeah.
You think he was influenced by Neoplatonism as a Greek?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, you know, one of the things that Christianity did is it took Torah, all right, and Paul in particular interfaced with Torah from the point of view of a Greco-Roman culture, all right, and so yes, his interpretation of Torah is in that frame of reference and understanding. So sure, those are the words he uses. And the interesting thing for us now is we're reading Torah and we're reading Paul with very different philosophical frameworks and understandings of what's going on. For me, the huge one is that everything evolves.
What is Platonism? I've never heard of that.
Deriving from Plato.
Oh, Plato? Okay. Okay. All right. Never associated, connected.
It's New Plato. New Plato.
Okay. Okay. All right.
You know, and it's true. So you got to ask yourself, well, okay, there's a particular philosophical bent that's weaving in here, you know, and different philosophical traditions do interact with the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition, and they're in dialogue. I mean, that is the nature of religion. It's true of all the other religions too. That's why I think my theology professor, though I fought him tooth and nail when he said this to me the first time, I think he's right. Religions are like languages. They impact one another. They talk to one another. And we are seeing that big time right now. We are watching the Eastern traditions come into liberal Christianity and move it towards an expression of spiritual practice that I think Christianity has been, Protestant Christianity has been devoid of for too long. Protestant Christianity has been all about sort of an intellectual, believe X, Y, Z and you're saved.
Yeah.
Okay? But drawing in the Eastern traditions, they've challenged us to see in our own tradition the need for spiritual formation. And it's thoroughgoing in Paul. You know, the man was a mystic. He talked about being in the ninth heaven, for crying out loud. You know, he was... I asked my Pauline professor, Dr. Ochtmar, once what that meant. He said, well, I'm sure it's spiritual, but I don't have a clue. It's because it wasn't part of his frame of reference. But I find it exciting that that's where he is. Paul is focused on the Christ, which is this foundational creative principle. It's difficult to talk about this without me projecting my own understanding and worldview upon it, right? Since I see the world as being an expression of the love of God, of the creative power of God, the creative urgency unfolding. That's it's the evolutionary impulse. That's the way I see God. And it's very easy for me to read Paul and go, see, that's what he was talking about. I'm not so sure he had exactly that philosophical frame. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, this is pretty fascinating. So not to bring up not to pick up a scar, but you could then interpret your first wife's passing as a natural part of God's universe of death and renewal and bringing something new. Is that, do I kind of get that?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do interpret it that way.
And you were kind of the new creation when you came to that conclusion. You were part of that newness, that renewal.
I'm part of that. You know, I think about the way God has unfolded our lives since. Now, first of all, I should tell you that I really do believe that as Debbie died, that doesn't mean that her identity, her soul, I don't know what to call it, is not cared for and in the arms and the love of God. I believe that absolutely.
Yeah.
But what did God unfold from there? Barbara is like my second wife. It's like the perfect mother for my son Matthew. I mean, I've had two other kids, and they were difficult boys, right? I'm good at this. I put boundaries up. I keep them in, right? My son needed this, okay? And that's what Barbara did. And there's a way in which there's joy and thanksgiving in what unfolded following Debbie's death. So yes, I do see that as a natural way. I do see God as unfolding from death to new life. And as a result, I don't see a lot of magic. You know, so things could really fall apart now. I do believe ultimately God will get God's way. As I like to say, 13.82 billion years from the Big Bang to Shakespeare, I'm going to call that a trajectory, you know, and say we're going somewhere. And I think that's what the Apostle Paul sees. It's just that he, like my wife Barbara, thinks it's coming soon. I think it's going to take a while.
It didn't come soon. I mean,
right.
his expression is present tense. We will be lifted up.
That's right.
Yeah, it didn't come at all.
It didn't come at all. And then we arrive, and so this is a time to bring in this next thing. We then come into a couple of letters that are attributed to Paul. All right? Colossians and Ephesians. Now, scholars will debate day and night about whether or not the Apostle Paul wrote those letters. Okay? My Pauline professor, I love the way he put it about Colossians. He said, every time I read the book of Colossians in English, I think Paul wrote it. And every time I read it in Greek, I am certain he didn't. And there's just, I can't make that claim, you know, but there's a change in style. And remember I said a couple of weeks ago, that doesn't mean that there's a lie in the Bible. Okay, remember I told the story about Rodin in the movie where his lover, whose name I've forgotten, was a sculptor, and she sculpted this foot, and he looked at it, and he thought it was so good he was willing to put his name on it, and so he signed it. It was in honor of the work she'd done. That's why he put his name on it. Okay? In a sense, the church has done that for Ephesians and Colossians. They've said, this is in the Pauline tradition. We're putting Paul's name on it. All right? But what's interesting is it goes further into this cosmic Jesus. Both of those letters do. Could it be a development of the original apostles' thought? Yeah, I guess. But it does seem to be a development that comes like couple of decades later. I mean, it feels like, at least to me, it could be somebody different. But it's much more cosmic in attaching to that cosmic creative force. Yeah.
Warfare in high places, Ephesians, or maybe it's Colossians, I can't remember.
More Ephesians, at least the more I think of it that way, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Ephesians. I have a lot of trouble with that, and I hear a lot of evangelicals talking about that. Just makes me more and more off-put.
Okay, so what happens there? I mean, I get it. It's a little like the passages about women shouldn't speak in the church in First Corinthians. Okay. All right. Well, since I think everything evolves, right, I've got to understand that that social attitudes towards women evolve, religious attitudes evolve. All those things evolve. Okay, and all those things are part of a worldview that we live in. And so when I read the scriptures, I ask myself, well, what's worldview, and what is God saying? Those are two different things, and there's not a clean line. I don't claim to, have a clean line there, but that's what I'm wrestling with. I'm trying to look at them and say, well, okay, Paul in the first century wrote it this way. What was his experience of the divine that made him say that? That's always my question. And how then do I describe it given our worldview, the way we look at the world? That's what Paul did with Torah. It's always an interpretive. That's why we walk by faith. We wrestle with these texts and we seek it. But it is, you look at it, and if people are going to take it literally, it puts us in trouble now.
I see it as the old, maybe Greek, I don't know, Jewish view that everything here on earth is happening in heaven. We are a reflection of what happens there. Therefore, in the Revelation, you get the dragon kicked out of heaven down to here, and now we're in real trouble. But what he was doing up there is happening down here. And so I see that as a...
Now you're sounding like Plato.
Well, yeah. I just see it as a part of an old worldview, that we would no longer believe in.
Yeah, and so, but are we rejecting the faith? We're really not.
Is that a beer or a
That's
Coke?
a Coca-Cola. That's a Coca-Cola.
True.
I decided I wanted to drink that instead of finishing the wine. Just I did have that came with dinner.
It would be
with dinner
embarrassing
when my wife brought it down.
Looks like a cab.
But it's a sin. But what's exciting to me about this is the fundamental things that Paul understood, that we're not divided. And whoever wrote the letter to the Colossians talked about God's purpose of drawing all things together in perfect harmony. That's like one of the theme verses for me. It's like that's the end point of creation. That's where the trajectory is going. And we're looking for that peace, for that wholeness. I mean, it's not discontinuous with Torah. It's a development of Torah.
Well, I mean, you can see it playing out sociologically right now. As people from all over the world come to America, and we discovered they're just like us. There's no difference. We're all brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's amazing to see how all this unfolds.
Mm-hmm. We're on.
I just think we're better off accepting that in God's universe, everything evolves. And that's where it begins for us. And that this creative Christ, the template for the patterns that connect in creation that Paul talks about, that this is the fundamental impulse. And I'm going to call the nature of it love. Why? Because it's moving to draw all things together in perfect harmony. It starts by joining particles together, and particles become atoms, and atoms become molecules, and molecules, eventually they become us. Consciousness emerges. How crazy is that?
So Christ versus Jesus, where do you put Jesus?
Oh, well, now I'm going to be outrageous. Okay. So Jesus was an expression of the creative urgency, the evolutionary impulse, the love of God. so are every one of you. And that was always the point. I don't think Jesus ever wanted to be different. You look at the Gospel of John and he says, hey, look, you're going to do all the things I've done and more. All right? When we put him in the Gospels, we've idealized the Christ figure as it unfolds in an individual. And I think that's gorgeous, you know? But to suggest that somehow Jesus is up there and, whoa, we can never, you know, we are expressions of the love of God, for crying out loud. And if we think that somehow we're not, then that holds us back from really being what we were called to be. That's why I love the Gospel of John, Jack.
You're sounding like Joel Osteen.
No, I'm not. He's success-oriented.
Well, he's human potential, too.
But human potential, why? Okay? It's because God is expressing himself through us. And when we move against it, well, that's when death happens and new life has to emerge. Lena?
Okay. For your article, can you write something on human potential?
Tomorrow?
Sure, you can put it out. It would be an interesting topic. I mean, what we can possibly do, you know?
So I could look at it. You know, in the prologue to the Gospel of John, we've been given power to become children of God. You know, that's in the center of that prologue, which is in a chiastic form. So that's the point of the prologue, is that we've been given power to become children of God. And that is exciting and hopeful. And so if we see ourselves primarily, meaning if we have our identity stuck in the idea that we are sinners, I think that's where we make the mistake. It's not that we're not. It's not that we're not broken and that we haven't completed our expression of love. I'm not trying to say that. But our fundamental identity in the first chapter of Genesis, and God saw what he had created, and it said it was very good. That's the fundamental identity of who we are. And when we don't live up to that, well, that means we're not living up to what we really are. Little hope, you know? God always works through us. That is kind of going to be the point of this Sunday sermon, I think. Preaching on Moses and the burning bush. You know, I am who I am is what he says, or I will be who I will be. I mean, scholars fight about verb tense around that all the time. And I'm just struck by how many times in the passage, you know, Moses says, I am here. It's like when we say I am and then we fill it out, we're an expression of something. We're an expression of the initial I am. God sees the suffering of God's people and decides to do something and then works through creation, works through us. That's how the creative power and love of God unfolds. I get a little evangelistic about this, because I think this is something to live up to be. As opposed to, sometimes I think the church says something like this. Well, Jesus was nice, and so we should be nice too. And I just think, while it's good for us to be nice, that's not what this is about. This is about the power of God and what it's doing. There are plenty of people out there who know how to be nice without that.
There are structures out there that you have to struggle against, and that obviates being nice sometimes.
Yeah, and we wrestle, and if we're going to act out of love all the time, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean we put up with everything. If I was going to love my stepson, it didn't mean I was going to let him get away with the things he wanted to get away with. I had to put up boundaries. Otherwise, I would not have been helping him become everything he could be.
That's right. What about Paul and homosexuality? The first chapter is quite a little screed.
Yeah, so we can unfold that. I mean, consider what I've said about it, all right? So he was living in a culture that had attitudes about homosexuality. We live in a culture that has some of those too, okay? And some of what he talks about is probably usury sexuality. It's not a treatise on sexuality, the end of the first chapter of Romans. He's just giving examples of what happens when people ignore the power and the movement of God. Right? And he's pointing to homosexuality because apparently the version of it was usury. Well,
Pederasty?
Maybe. Again, it's not a treatise. There's a limit to what we can know about that, but shoot, we could apply that to heterosexuality and pornography now. It's sexuality used to separate people rather than to draw people into union and perfection. Now, I live in a worldview where, I think gay folk have the capacity to love in the same way I do. So I don't think that homosexuality, and Paul didn't know that. He didn't, you see what I mean? It was just, for instance, in the Hebrew scriptures, sexuality is very, is open in a different way. So they believed in polygamy. Okay, we now think that's appalling. But those are social constructs. Because I, unfortunately, have friends that think polyamory is the way to go. All right? And they're trying to make a case that you do it with love in your heart. I don't think it works. That's my problem with it. But, okay, that's what they think. My point is that sexuality is one of those things that unfolds in different ways in different societies at different times. The real issue is, are we using sex in such a way that draws people together or in such a way that undermines them and splits them apart? That's my question when I read those texts, not whether somebody's gay or not. So that's how I deal with it. The point of the text was to say, look, all you have to do is look around and see that when people are using each other and hurting each other, the wrath of God is unfolded upon them. My mother, at 82 years of age, was in the continuing care facility they were in. She was writing biographies of the new residents that came in. It's a 12-story place. And this guy moved in, and his partner of 40 years had just died. His gay partner of 40 years had just died. And he was apparently a very devout Christian, Metropolitan Community Church. And my mother met him, talked to him, just thought he was great, wrote about him. And then she called me up that night and she said, well, I'm not sure what the Apostle Paul was talking about at the end of the first chapter of Romans. I'm sure he was right, but whatever he was talking about, it wasn't that. I think she's right. She was seeing a love described between two people that was generative for those two people. She said, no, that wasn't what Paul was talking about.
I read it as pederasty. He's looking at a Greek custom in which was unnatural. We would call it illegal. We would call it exploitative today. and saying that's not right. But naturally, if you are a natural homosexual, that's fine. But if you're a natural heterosexual, you don't do that. That's what I think.
And you could be right, Jack. And I have no particular pony in the race to say you're wrong about it. I tend to think when scholars move to ideas like that and nail it down that way, I just sometimes feel like they're putting a little bit too much content into too few words. It's like, yeah, maybe, and that's a good explanation, but I don't know. The vagaries of history, it gets pretty foggy at a certain